Hello and welcome to the Dissident Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Dissidents Podcast. We've got some different faces for you all today. The usual team has the week off. I'm Chris Bush. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a co-founder of 1776 Forward, which is one of the ILV's partner organizations. And we jointly sponsor with ILV the Free Speech Forward podcast, which is a series under this Dissidents banner. If you haven't checked us out over there, we'd love to have you listen in. In that podcast, we speak to leaders and activists in free speech and really get their behind the scenes stories of how they came to defending that critical right, and really just seek to affirm that core value, that core liberal value that is so often, and in particular at present times, under assault. And I'm joined today by James Petz. Hey, James, how are you doing?
Good afternoon. Very well, thank you.
Great to have you here. So for many of you probably know James. He's one of ILV's foremost advisors, and you've probably seen him on various ILV panels and content, including the Dissidents Podcast and our Free Speech Forward podcast. For those of you who don't know him, James is a lawyer or barrister in English parlance, which is where James is based. I learned that word when we first met. And he'll be bringing his considerable legal talents and experience to today's discussion. So let's turn to that discussion. We're going to do it a little differently since neither James nor I have an academic background like many of the Dissidents hosts, where they'll typically choose an academic text and kind of break that down. We thought more we would have a conversation on a topic that's pretty hot topic and just widely impacting all of us day to day, which is we're calling it liberal alternatives to state coercion in economic affairs. And just given my background as a businessman, James' background as a commercial lawyer, we thought we could bring some different perspectives. So, what prompted actually the thought for today's discussion, James, if you recall, was a mini debate you and I were having with some of the other ILV members offline about, I think it was particularly some of the new policies here in the U.S. that were impacting education and universities and funding to them. So we'll kind of use that lens to set the stage. We're now 3 months into a new U.S. presidential administration, the second non-synchronous Trump term, and there have been lots of dramatic policy changes, a lot of 180 U-turns versus the last administration, and some of them quite disruptive, a lot having to do with funding and funding halts or changes in requirements with strings attached to institutions and organizations to continue receiving that funding. And that has understandably rankled many people. But it raises some interesting questions about, number one, is this even legal and constitutional for the executive to do? And then number two, is it moral or appropriate? Which I think gets to an even deeper question, which is what is the proper role for the state in such economic spheres of life? So,
Yes.
So
I
that's
can't answer number one because I don't have expertise in U.S. constitutional law, so we'll have to leave that to one of the day.
Well, yeah, so that's a good point. We're going to set number one aside and focus more on the number two question. I think that's right and appropriate. Because frankly, the moral question it transcends just the U.S. context. We're just using that. That was what prompted both our mini debate offline and now our discussion here online. So, we'll just go into that. And James, you chose an interesting framing here of the problem, singling out specifically the realms of welfare and IP for what we call economic affairs. So we'll just have a conversation around that. And I thought maybe we could start by you just maybe setting the tables for me and anyone else listening about kind of what you see as the main problem. You use the term dealing with the safety of concentrated power in economic matters, particularly welfare and so-called IP. So I'd love to just hear you frame the problem and even what you mean by some of those terms.
Yes. Well, there are quite a number of different things to go through there. Let's start with how it started in our internal discussions and why this is relevant.
Yeah.
Which is this. There is, I understand, a considerable controversy at present in the United States about the executive of that government using its financial power to withdraw funding to universities that are not doing things that the executive would like them to do, and threatening them, say, if you do not follow this particular policy, we will take away all your funding. And the response to that is putting aside for a moment whether you agree with whether those things should be done. It is a problem that anyone has the power to do that, ever, right? Because it is a problem that anyone has the power to say, unless you do to an independent institution, unless you do the thing that I'm telling you to do, you can't continue to operate properly. And that arises as a result of the fact that, subject to this question number one, which neither of us have sufficient expertise to talk about, but this arises as a result of the fact that the state has the power to decide where or what to fund and what money to give out. And because, in fact, it is directly from the state and directly from the executive branch of the state that the funding for an awful lot of things that are essential to a functioning society comes. And so a very small number of people, those who happen to have executive power at any given time, are able to cause massive disruption and able to exert really quite dangerous levels of power by threatening to cut off funding. And we're talking, the conversation is framed in terms of economic liberty. But I think, in common with many classical liberals, I don't think that there is any meaningful distinction between economic and non-economic liberty, because everything requires resources. And economics is all about resources. So all liberty is economic liberty, and economic liberty is all liberty. You can't have liberty without having economic liberty.
Okay.
So the question is, the problem is, and again, whatever you think or don't think about the particular president that one has at the moment, you can just imagine a president with completely opposite views doing the same thing. It would still be a problem.
Well, and in fact, they have in past presidencies.
Perhaps in more subtle ways. And it's quite interesting that the current president is doing so in unsubtle ways, which actually might help to spur opposition to that kind of power being exercised at all, whether subtly or otherwise. Right? So I don't think that it is as unique a problem to the current administration as some people think or claim that it is.
I would agree.
But it's a problem that anyone ever has that kind of power. And the reason that anyone has that kind of power is because it has been thought by some people to be beneficial over the course of many years, slowly adding to this, to have things that are very important for the functioning of society funded directly by the people who have coercive power. That is, by the executive and the state in general. And the history of this I talked about in the podcast that I dealt with Mike Burke last year. So I won't give the whole detail. Now, the potted version is there was a time when liberal meant what we now call classical liberal, and that's why we call it classical liberal, which is people who believed in freedom in economic and non-economic terms. Generally, Millicent Fawcett, for example, was a classical liberal. She talked about free trade as well as female emancipation and female suffrage. And John Stuart Mill is a classical liberal. But at the beginning of the 20th century, there came a time when people who had those ideas also thought that it might be helpful for the state to take on a bigger role in welfare, and I think part came in part because this movement came shortly after the First World War, where there was a high level of trust in the state, perhaps unjustifiably, but there's a far greater alignment of interest between the state and the public in wartime than there is most of the time. And then that turned into people who believed in a lot of the things that classical liberals believed in, also believing in the state having a greater role in things that would now be thought of as welfare and providing for people. Because it was thought that the state could do that effectively. But that then led to a problem of there being a lot of concentration of power in the hands of the state, which can then be and has been abused, actually to cause very serious harm. And often the abuse consists in part of doing things to make it hard to uncover the abuse.
Yep. Wow. Okay. Thank you.
One of the reasons that it's not safe to have the power to do these things in the hands of the same people as have the power to coerce.
Right. Well, and so you raise an interesting question. So you tied it back to, even the history. I like the history because, we think about people who said, kind of economic liberty versus non-economic liberty. It sounds like you're saying you don't really see a distinction between the two.
Yes. And in fact,
Um,
there can't be a distinction. It's logically impossible to have liberty of anything without having some kind of economic liberty as well. If one person's controlling all the resources, right, nobody's free about anything.
well, and I mean, I certainly agree with you. This is something we at 1776 Forward advocate, which in our creed and ideal, what we call philosophical liberalism, is it shares many of the traits of free markets and free speech and consent of the governed of like classical liberalism, but
Yes.
has a more forward-looking moral foundation to achieve broader human flourishing and greatness even. Um, but one of the things we talk about there is that
The classical liberals didn't have a forward-looking vision for human flourishing, but that's a topic perhaps for another day.
what's that? Sorry, I missed the first
I
part.
possibly dispute that the classical liberals didn't have a forward-looking vision for human flourishing, but that's perhaps a topic for another day.
Well, I mean, that's partly why we felt there needed to be a new kind of term to distinguish from classical liberal, and something in the name even implies kind of looking backwards versus trying to apply liberal principles going forward, which is what matters for those of us alive today. But I guess my point is we talk about how this artificial distinction between so-called economic matters and non-economic matters was one of the ways conceptually and linguistically and otherwise that I guess as you have put it, these proponents of state intervention in these affairs and helping people, that's how they kind of achieved it, right? Was creating this artificial divide. So I guess with that said, then, are you saying if you don't see any of that divide, are you saying that pretty much what's the limiting principle, if any, I guess, to this point that you're saying the coercive intervention by the state as such is the problem? Like, is there a limit or a distinction between those areas where you see the coercion as justified and not?
Yes. So the starting point is the limiting principle is the same in economic and non-economic cases because there is no distinction between economic and non-economic cases. There is a limiting principle, which is that coercion is justified when and only when the harm inherent in coercion is surpassed by the harm prevented by the coercion. And all coercion results in harm, but it's just that sometimes it prevents even greater harm.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, that sounds almost a little slippery slope-ish. I don't know. Say that again. So the coercion
is justified when and only when the harm inherent in coercion is surpassed by the harm prevented by that coercion. So, for example, a prohibition on murder. Obviously, the people who want to kill people are going to be restrained in some way, but the ability, the freedom from being killed yourself is worth far more to any given person than the freedom to kill others. And so in that case, the harm inherent in the coercion is far less than the harm prevented by the coercion. And that's an example of justified coercion.
I see. So in that instance, what you're saying is the coercion of the state preventing murder is justified because it's much less than the harm that would be created by letting everybody just willy-nilly murder everybody, kind of like the Purge style. If you've seen that movie.
I mean, it's perhaps the best way of framing it is that any given person's freedom to kill other people is worth less to that person than the knowledge that that person will be safe from being killed by others.
Yes, got it. I needed. There's a lot of logic involved in that, but I follow you. I guess because the way I think of it is, and certainly talking in liberal terms and kind of the history of philosophical and classical and other liberals talking about the issue of force is that they often draw the distinction, one which makes sense to me, of the coercion or the force being justified in retaliatory defensive purposes, as opposed to necessarily kind of initiatory and offensive purposes. So does that, I'm sure you've heard that line of reasoning regarding state force. How does that overlay with your principle, or do you kind of not see that?
I'm not sure that I'd describe the distinction in those terms, not least because what counts as defensive and offensive depends on prior assumptions that themselves require precisely the same justification as just directly justifying coercion that way. So I don't think that's necessarily the best way of looking at things. But depending on how you define what counts precisely as defense and offense will depend on whether you get to the same result or not. I mean, what does defense mean exactly? What is the thing being defended? So property rights, for example, you have to define a thing called a property right and say, I have a right to coerce someone from not doing this thing in this thing that I call mine. And you have to have an entire system before you can say that you've got this thing to defend. And you've got to be able to justify that entire system before you can say that this is defense rather than offense. Now, property rights, I believe, are justified, but I don't think you can get there by starting with the principle that you're looking at defense.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I guess maybe the counterpoint would be rights are the dividing line. So, in other words, and certainly to take, say, the American founders' view, which itself was an enlightened influence view from people like John Locke, that rights are inherent, they're innate to human nature, like that it's human nature and what our requirements of that nature entail, such as we need to think and take actions on our thoughts to figure out what works for our life, and you can't really do that unless you're free to experiment, and that's kind of that's the position and the nature that defines what we need and ought to do, which is freedom and the right to live our life and not have it taken from us as we're figuring that out and working to survive. So I guess they would say rights is what draws the lines, whether or not you have a system in place, already erected to protect them, kind of that kind of metaphysical reality dictates then the ethical principle that you cannot violate life, liberty, and property, since those are just extensions of human nature, human life. And then I guess the defense would be any action that violates those rights to life, liberty, and property would be kind of an aggressive, initiatory, or offensive act of coercion, which then you kind of wielding state power in defense against those. That's kind of, I guess, the logic.
Yeah. I mean, in that analysis, what counts as a right is doing all the work, and what's defensive and offensive is just a way of framing upholding those rights. So I'm not sure that necessarily gives any weight to the concept of defense and offense in this context, which is fine.
Well, maybe that's the wrong aspect to hinge it on, whether it's defensive or offensive. I think it's more, wielding it in defense of individual rights is justified because you're really just defending the principle of individual rights, which is
so there are a couple of things to unpick here. First of all, the question is what's the basis for saying that those are rights? I don't agree with this natural law concept that rights are inherent, because that begs the question of, well, what's the basis for saying that this is inherent and this isn't inherent, right? I think one has to look at what the consequences are of people having rights. Rights in a legal sense, and one may talk about rights in another sense, which it's important to clarify it in that way, but rights in a legal sense are a product of a legal system, and it is perfectly possible for a legal system to prescribe things as rights that ought not be rights, and not to prescribe things as rights that ought to be rights. And whether they are rights or not, or whether they ought to be rights or not, is a different question from whether they are rights or not. And that's an important distinction to make, because it's important to be able to criticize a legal system and say, this legal system provides for these things as rights, but it shouldn't do because that is harmful. Or this system doesn't provide for these things as rights, but it should do because not doing so is harmful. So that's a particular problem with this concept of natural rights, is that you break down the distinction between what the law does say and what the law should say, and make it very difficult to separate those things out and analyze the two things distinctly meaningfully, which is really important to do for a number of reasons, one of which is it's important to do that to criticize the law where it's wrong and be able to do that. So that's one thing. And then if you get away from this concept of natural rights, then the question ends up being, well, what's the basis on which one can properly decide what counts as a right? So it's perfectly possible, not necessarily desirable, to say that everyone has a right to be given money by the state, right? And you can then base the rights on that and say, well, if the state isn't giving you money, then you're by forcing the state to give you money, you're defending that right. that doesn't necessarily mean that is the right thing to have as a right. And so that doesn't, again, answer our fundamental question as to what the right way of doing these things are. And you gave the example of property, right? What counts as property? What can you own? And that takes us into the intellectual property question that we're having a little later on, as to what actually the boundaries of property ought to be, because we talked about property rights, and intellectual property is one of the important things.
Right.
But let's come back for a moment to one thing that may be on some of the minds of people who are listening to this and have heard the beginning and not the rest of this yet, which is, if you're not having the state doing welfare, right, who is going to do welfare? How
Right.
are the important interests that the state protects when it does welfare going to be protected otherwise?
Right.
And this is an important thing, right? It's often thought that the only possible alternatives are, on the one hand, the state, the people with the concentrated coercive power, actually directly providing these services, or on the other hand, these services not being provided unless people are willing to do this voluntarily, if people often aren't. And that stark dichotomy, which I think is a false dichotomy, is, I think, in part responsible for the state having dangerous levels of coercive power. And by dangerous, I mean is apt to deliberately to exercise it in ways that are not in the public interest and may be extremely harmful to the public, but are in the interest of the individual politicians who are exercising it.
Yeah. Well, and I, not to get hung up on the prior discussion of rights, but to me, that's partly how you get out of some of those circular kind of arguments, of kind of what is rights, and how do you define them? I think the natural law point is that, yeah, obviously rights are a human construct. They're really a conceptual construct, but they're referring to kind of, like I said, the needs of each human being qua human as a human for survival in a social context, right? So like if you're on a desert island, you don't need rights because you don't need to be protected. Your life, liberty, and property doesn't need to be protected from anybody else. Rights are the way that we conceptually and then, yes, ultimately legally kind of define, our freedom of action in a social context. And, I think no doubt the concept of rights is, I think, a very confused one and has been probably intentionally further confused over time by people who, the enemies of liberalism, or just people who want, kind of free money, given the topic of today's discussion. But that's, I think, what you would normally appeal to answer some of these questions of like, well, is it proper to just give people free money? Where does that money come from? Well, you have to take it from somebody else first. Is that proper taking? Well, you can only answer that if you have the concept of, well, property rights and life and liberty in the first place, to then say, well, if you're using coercion to violate some of those rights from someone else in order to give a right to someone else, then you've already kind of broken the chain of rights protection, if you will. So, and that, I think, gets to the distinction of so-called positive versus negative rights, which is negative rights being you just need to everybody leave me alone. You can't take life, liberty, property from me, versus, oh, you have the right to healthcare or, protection provided by somebody else. So it's a
I mean, again,
proactive action.
I mean, I wouldn't say that that's the best way of drawing the distinction, because there is a sense in which the borderline between so-called negative and so-called positive rights are potentially fuzzy. So think about, for example, funding for the police. How are your rights not to be coerced by other private citizens going to be upheld except by someone somewhere resourcing the people who will actually go around and uphold those rights, your rights? So I don't think that's quite the right line for drawing the distinction. I think some people who favor large governments may find that that's an easy target for a conceptual attack and say, well, you've got this problem and therefore the whole house of cards falls down. Whereas actually, I don't think one does that. I think one can not take, I mean, I don't, although we agree on a number of things, I think we perhaps don't have 100% alignment, which does make this discussion more interesting.
Yeah.
But the view that I certainly take is that actually you've got to look at, rather than looking at these questions whether a right is positive or negative in this sense, rather than looking at whether something is offense or defense, one has to look at the prior question of, is this coercion justified? Is this the minimum level of coercion necessary to achieve the end? And does that end justify the harm inherent in the coercion?
Mm.
And that may or may not justify a whole range of different kinds of coercion, albeit it will tend less to justifying things that concentrate power more than less. Because the
Yeah.
more concentrated the coercive power is, the less safe it is, because the more opportunity there is for abuse of that power, and the more opportunity there is for that person who has that power to cause harm. The problem is, the more power that a person has, the more that a person is able to disregard the interests of others and to
Sure.
trade off an arbitrarily large amount of harm to others for an arbitrarily small benefit to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That is the danger of concentrated coercive power.
Concentrated, yep, for sure.
So that's the thing you want to protect against. And so,
Interesting. It seems like you're. Yeah, I'm gonna have to ponder that one, because it seems like you are accepting that coercion is inherent to human relations, and so you're just saying the test is whether essentially the ends are the least coercive results of as possible, right? If I'm understanding your
the
argument
least
correctly.
coercive way of achieving a justifiable
Right.
goal, justifiable by demonstrating clearly that the harm avoided by the coercion is significantly greater than the harm inherent in the coercion.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not sure I am fully bought into the view that coercion is intrinsic to human relation. It may be that it has been to date, but I don't know that it's necessarily intrinsic to what it means to be human, and or even to
I'm
have
not sure it has to be.
certainly liberal society.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure it has to be intrinsic to what it means to be human for it to be justifiable. I don't think those two things are necessarily one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you go back and ask, I mean, this is more about the rule of law than about economic liberalism. So this is perhaps a tangent, but an interesting one.
Yeah, it's
If you go back
relevant.
and ask, what happens if you don't have any government at all, right? So this is the distinction between anarchism and liberalism.
Yep.
What happens is you have people who aren't governments coercing people. So the question that I always pose is, in an anarchy, who would enforce the ban on governments? So I think realistically, you can't unless you've got people who are always caring about others more than themselves, which seems unlikely in the foreseeable future. That you're always going to have some level of coercion in a human society, or threat of coercion at least. It may not be an actuality of the same thing. You either have desirable or undesirable coercion, right? If you don't have desirable coercion, you will have undesirable coercion.
Right. Well, and I certainly, as a liberal, I don't advocate anarchy. I certainly advocate that government is a positive human and social construct. It actually properly defined and prescribed is what enables our flourishing and freedom. So I definitely grant you that. I think you're right. You do have to draw the limits at some point, and so I think it's just maybe different theories and different rationales for which limits you draw and why. So I guess with that said, then let's bring it back to the topic at hand. Like how would you draw those limits as it pertains to welfare? Just to finish off that part of this, and I guess I'll just add I said we wouldn't ask stacked questions, but this is a follow-on to it, which is, and then what do you mean by welfare? Like, are there any distinctions within welfare of different types that might apply this principle differently, whatever principle you're about to apply?
Right. So the starting point is, we ask the question I posed and I didn't answer a moment ago, on behalf of those perhaps who would think that state welfare is justified, is, if the state isn't going to do it, how is it going to be done?
Right.
Because these are important things, right? The providing people being healthy is an important thing. People not being in abject poverty is an important thing, and welfare inherently is obviously a good thing. Right? There's nothing bad about people receiving medical care. There's nothing bad about people who are very poor being less poor. These are good things that will want to happen. The question is, does it need to be done directly by the very same people who have the power to coerce other people and to set the rules? And I think the answer is no. The thing where coercion may be necessary is not in the deciding how exactly the welfare is to be administered, but in saying that people must give up some of their own money to fund the welfare of others. So the difference between, I think, perhaps the 19th century liberal position and perhaps your position and the position that I adopt is that coercion probably is justified to the extent of requiring people to give some proportion of their income to doing things to help others who are less fortunate than them. Where I differ, I think, from people who believe in large governments is that I don't think that it is the people who have a concentrated coercive power, in other words, the government itself, that should be deciding precisely how that is spent and having the concentrated power of choosing where that money goes. Because you then get the problem of abuse of power, whereby the people who have that power have the incentive to, and often do, trade off an arbitrarily large amount of harm to others for an arbitrarily small gain to themselves or those on whose support they require for that power. And you get problems of sectarianism. I have some essays on that. Have a look at those on the ILV website. We can have a podcast now to another date because that's a whole other topic.
That sounds exciting.
So what's the answer to that? Well, the answer is maintain a requirement for people to give money to welfare, but don't have the state control it. In other words, replace that proportion of tax that is currently spent on welfare, and I'll come to define that in a moment, with an obligation to give the same amount of money, or possibly even slightly more, to charities of the choosing of each individual. And that would be a radical deconcentration of power without reducing people's obligation to help others.
Interesting. So essentially, when you fill out your IRS tax forms, for those of us in the US,
Yes.
every year there'd be a subsection where the welfare portion, I guess, would be essentially you're just demonstrating that you did do it. It's more like a reporting requirement, and then you choose where that amount, and maybe it has, kind of limits, financial or quantitative parameters put around it, but then it's the responsibilities on you to direct it.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously there are implementational details that there are different possible ways of doing this, and I'm not necessarily committed to any one way. But
I'm just talking it aloud in my own head to understand it.
So, for example, you would, when you're filling your tax return, you would say, I have given this amount of money to this charity, this amount of money to this charity, and this amount of money to this charity.
Right.
And therefore, this is the amount of tax value. You still have to pay some tax, because we got back to earlier, you still have to have some funding for the government itself. You have to have some funding for things that aren't necessarily part of the coercive mechanisms of government, such as the police, the army, the diplomatic service, the legislature and executive itself. Right? So you still have to have some element of tax. But you'd say, this amount that I'm obliged to give in donations I have given to these charities, and then they could be checked. This charity would give a return to the IRS or the equivalent in any given jurisdiction, say, this person has given this amount of money to us. And not only could it be done in cash in the system that I suggest, but one could also do it in kind. So one could also, instead of giving the charity money, you would do voluntary work for the charity to that value. And that has an additional advantage, not just in deconcentrating power, but also in improving economic productivity. And you could also carry over the amount so for example, you give more than the amount in one particular year and then less in a subsequent year, and you could carry that over with interest, which again would give people more flexibility, would probably encourage greater giving. You could give, for example, if you become unemployed, you could spend a lot of your time working for a charity, right? Build up huge amounts of reserves, and then if you manage to get a job, perhaps paying a relatively small amount to start with, you could then say, well, I caught up on my reserves in the last few years. I don't then need to give anything in the next couple of years when I build up my resources. So you'd probably have more charitable giving overall because of that flexibility, and people would have more flexibility in doing things, and to be counter-cyclical, because at times of high unemployment, lots of people would end up doing the charity work and doing work rather than give cash. At times of low unemployment, people would tend more to give cash. So it would be more economically efficient, as well as deconcentrating power. It would have a lot of side benefits as well. And a lot of the kinds of response that one gets to this, when one first suggested on people who haven't heard this idea before, is something of the order of, but how will you make sure that people give money to the right charities, right? How are you going to stop people from giving all their money to a charity that likes birds or something like that? And the answer is, you have exactly the same problem in democracy. How do you stop people voting for the wrong political parties, right? You don't. You just make sure the consequences if they do as least bad as possible by reducing the amount of power that government has. And so it doesn't require more trust in people to get things right in the current system. It actually requires radically less trust, because the current system requires you have trust in a very small number of people with a very large amount of power. It's a single point of failure problem. If one or two people abuse their power, millions or billions of people suffer. Right? In a distributed system, if a few people decide to give the money to a completely stupid cause, then only a small amount of money is given
That's
to a completely
right.
stupid
Yeah.
cause. The likelihood of every last person in a particular jurisdiction giving their money to a bird charity is very small. The likelihood of a government abusing its power to give everyone's money to something that is designed to help the politician at the expense of everyone else is very large.
Right.
So
Right.
it doesn't make sure that the money goes to the right place, but the current system doesn't make sure the money goes to the right place, and the money is less likely to go to the right place in the current system because there's more chance of abuse of power. So
Yeah.
in both systems, you have the possibility of people idiosyncratically making a bad decision, but in the current system only, you've got, in addition to that, not only the possibility, but the overwhelming probability of people cynically abusing their power, deliberately giving the money to the wrong place, which is in fact done repeatedly. People will give their money or give other people's money to the people who are going to vote for them and deliberately ignore the interests of people who don't.
Yeah.
That is an endemic problem in democracies.
Just
That is
in here.
why just
Yeah.
choosing which government to vote for is nothing like enough of a defense mechanism against abuse of power. That is why it is important to have really strict limits on power, even of those who've been elected.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, as an individualist, I would actually to that complaint about, well, what if of people giving to the wrong charity, I would say, well, that's really not your problem. That's their problem. And that is inherent in the choice that each individual has and that we want to encourage. You're right. Actually, it's almost like people have outsourced that choice to the government and think that somehow solves the problem. But in fact, as you just showed, then you've just now concentrated the consequences of making bad choices with the money in the hands of people who frankly have far less incentive than you, whose funds it are, to oversee where the money goes, that it goes to serve your values and your interests.
In fact, they have an overwhelming interest to make sure that it doesn't. They have an overwhelming interest. I mean, one talks about not all politicians being bad people, and that's true. The trouble is the ones who aren't the bad people aren't the ones who are cynical enough to misuse the money and actually stay in power for long. So they have an overwhelming incentive to spend the money in ways that benefit people who are going to vote for them, and to ignore the interest of everyone who isn't going to vote for them.
Well, and that certainly is I think, just to bring it back to this discussion, that is the liberal argument. It's certainly the classical, philosophical, traditional, whatever we want to append onto it, a liberal argument against allowing this concentration of power in the first place on these affairs, because it can, it will, and it cannot be anything other than be abused and misused.
Precisely. Only the people who do in fact abuse it are going to stay in power for very long.
Right. And I just want to close out with one other clarification, which is, so it sounds like your answer to the problem of, so you grant the validity of the question, well, how do we ensure we help people with welfare?
Yes.
Like that's something like you think it should still be a requirement for people, but just let the people decide individually where the funds go.
Yes.
Like that's your solution to that question or that problem, right?
Yes, you dissipate power.
Yeah, got it. And, to you, I assume you mean the term welfare broadly, like whether it's welfare for the poor and the infirm, or medical and health welfare, or retirement, kind of any and all of those, you think the principle is the same?
So that's an important question. So let's get into the detail of what could be funded in that way and what couldn't be. And what can't be, which are things that inherently require the coercive power of the state. Practically anything else on which the state spends its money is susceptible to being done in that way and being dissipated in that way, rather than people being coerced into giving the money to a particular organization, which then has a complete and unfettered discretion as to how to spend that money. Right? You are coerced into giving your money, but you decide where to spend it on. So there are a number of different things, and it's not just money, it's also work to the value of, as we discussed earlier. So, I mean, take an example from my own profession, which is law. There was for a number of decades in the UK, and there is still to a very limited extent, a thing called legal aid. That was a system in which the state would pay for lawyers to represent people who couldn't afford representation themselves. And it's still largely the case in criminal law, but the lawyers are not paid very much. And so increasingly, people who are good don't tend to do that.
Right.
But it is very limited now in the case in civil law. You don't get that in personal injury case. You don't get that if you're claiming damages. Only very rarely do you get that. So actually, a lot of people can't afford to bring claims in the civil courts or even defend claims, and that leads to very serious injustice. I do a lot of work pro bono, but of course, there's only so much time that one can actually spend doing work without getting paid for it.
Right.
So, an example of how the doing this in kind would work is lawyers doing pro bono work could effectively pay a proportion of what is now taxed by doing that, and being able to do work for others who can't afford it for free, as at least part of their contribution to what is now taxed, what would be welfare in the future, or welfare funding in the future.
Right.
So that's an example of a way that this could be done. And of course, again, that is productivity enhancing.
Right.
And the same applies to doctors, right? So instead of in the US, it's perhaps more relevant because you tend to have more private healthcare than you do in the UK. In the UK, you have the National Health Service, which is its own difficulty. If anyone's heard of the Staffordshire Hospital scandal in about mid-2000s, you'll know quite how serious abuse of power can be in that institution. But if you have doctors who are privately employed, who do their own work for paying patients, and then have to give a certain amount of their money or time to welfare, at least they have the choices whether to give money or time, but those who want to give time might then give their time for working in hospitals that give medical services to free people who need it. And again, that's going to be more efficient by quite a long way than the state gathering money and then giving it out at its whim.
Right. Well, and I just lost my train of thought. What was I gonna say? Oh, it sounds like you're now I understand why you use specifically the word concentrated coercive power, because it sounds like it's the concentration of this power to decide that is what you see as the real problem, rather than perhaps the coercion itself. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but am I grasping? Because your solution is to diffuse that, still make it compulsory, but to diffuse the choice and the power to choose down to, I guess, the people who are compelled, right?
Yes.
The individuals.
And it's less coercion on those people, because if you say, you must give me your money, rather than you must choose to give your money to one of these causes, right? The latter is less coercive than the former.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now I see the chain of causality and logic for your point. So interesting. Yeah. And the current situation that even prompted this debate and now this discussion about the universities, it's further complicated because the state would argue that in fact it's a little bit disingenuous, but it's also, it is true that they're also trying to get these institutions to follow certain laws that they're already, must adhere to, and in the state's argument, at least, haven't been. So, but that big picture to me, that is just, it's just rationalization for their actions, and B, it just serves as further proof that, like, the moment you start having that relationship of being dependent on the state who has the concentrated power, whether it's a law or just a preference of the politician in power, that's inherent to that structure, that they're going to wield it in that way.
Fundamental to the rule of law and a liberal democracy is a separation of the powers, right? So the consequences of unlawful behavior must be a judicial decision, not an executive decision. So that kind of action blurs that separation of the powers. And if you have concentration of power, that's the opposite of separation of powers.
Yeah, well, to put my own legal hat on for a minute here, my non-legal legal hat, we were talking, James and I, about, just given my background in business, I know enough to be dangerous, but I think they would argue, well, it's the executive branch's job to enforce the laws, right? So they would be the ones who have to bring a case against a lawbreaker. Obviously, the judiciary will adjudicate the final outcome, but the executive has to make a determination whether someone has broken it in the first place. So, I think their position.
That's fine if the executive then brings a case and has the court to decide what the consequences should be, and then the executive were to follow what the consequences described by the court are. That's very different from the executive saying, I'm going to do this because I think you've broken the law, without actually having any judicial authority involved at all.
Yeah, I see. That's an interesting counterpoint to that. Yeah, and I don't know the particulars of how that separation of powers plays out in these cases, like where the line is of, I mean, and this is the thing, the branches are constantly testing the lines of their powers too. I mean, to some extent, that is the proper exercise of co-equal separation of powers. But yeah, I just am not sure where that line is between when they're, stepping into kind of judicial or extrajudicial and legislative powers that aren't there, or whether it's a proper exercise of the executive function.
Yes, I think we're probably less well placed to talk about the details of the individual case and more well placed to look at the principles.
Exactly. Well, and so that's my point, is like, to me, even if they could win a legal case, I guess that's what I'm really getting at, is even if they could win on the legal and constitutional merits, that they are in fact properly exercising an executive function of enforcing the laws. The fundamental point remains that the only reason they're in this position in the first place, and these universities or other funding recipients have this risk imposed on them, is because this power has been concentrated in the state in the first place.
Yes, because people misguidedly thought it was a good idea the people who have the coercive power also actually to administer a very large amount of money that receive coercive from other people.
And that's why, I certainly don't, there's not much leg to stand on if those who are objecting to it are only objecting to it because of which party or which person is in power and wielding that power. Like, I agree with you. My hope is that this becomes a teaching moment for all liberals or freedom-minded people, no matter what side of the spectrum they're on politically, to kind of see the general principle here, and let's, dial back this power as such.
See the risk to their own personal interest.
Yeah. So let's turn really quickly then to the other half of this equation that you put up, which is IP, and in particular, you used you called it so-called IP, which is provocative already. As an economic liberal and a laissez-faire capitalist, it's interesting. I've only recently started to hear some of the arguments from other liberals against IP protections, and I can see the position on both sides. But my natural instinct is that IP regime is a protection or an extension of property rights. So it sounds like you don't think that, though. So let's hear your position on this one.
Okay, well, there are two strands. Let's start with this philosophical question of why I said so-called intellectual property. And the answer is that because it isn't properly so-called, because you're not dealing with resource conflict management in the same way as you're dealing with physical property. So the point of true property is you have ownership rights to deal with the fact that you can't have two people doing different things with it at the same time. So if I'm in my house, I can't use my house properly if anyone from the street can come in and decide to use my kitchen and sit down and sleep in my bed, right? I can't sleep in my bed if someone else is sleeping in my bed. And that is why you have ownership rights. That is the justification for true property. And that is what property fundamentally is. So-called intellectual property doesn't rely on that, because any number of people can use the same piece of music at the same time. There's nothing about me listening to a piece of music that stops anyone else from doing so. The purported justification for intellectual property is very different. The purported justification is, if you don't create this monopoly whereby people who have created a thing consisting of information can coercively restrain others from reproducing it or using it in particular ways, and charge people for doing so, then people will not have an incentive to create that thing, and therefore everyone will be worse off. Now, even if that's true, even if it is fully justified, the justification for it is radically different from the justification for true property, and the nature of the thing is radically different from true property. So even if you agree that so-called IP is fully justified, it's still wrong to call it IP.
I see. So you're actually making a conceptual and semantic distinction
Yeah.
here, not necessarily a legal and moral one, if I'm understanding, at least in the
Yeah.
terminology of intellectual property rights.
Yes, I mean this point is certainly not. I'm not the only person to make this, right? This was made by Professor Harris a number of years ago. That it is a different kind of thing, and the
I see.
justification was different.
So we should
And
call it something different.
we
Yeah.
should call it something different. And it isn't just an entirely arid intellectual point that only academics care about, because it's really important to understand that the justifications are different, and therefore the fact that true property is justified tells us literally nothing about whether so-called IP is justified. You have to have a completely separate justification, and it may justify a completely separate, different set of rules. So you can't just elide one with the other. This comes to the fallacy of equivocation,
Yep.
which we're dealing with in one of our forthcoming videos. An argument that works for true property doesn't automatically work for so-called intellectual property. So you have to start from first principles in relation to that and fully justify it from nothing.
Okay, I'll grant you that. I love first principles. That's one of our chief methods we champion at 1776 forward. Interesting. So then, can you kind of define it? But now that we're clear on the distinction you're drawing here, can you just maybe clarify and articulate like what you see as what we now call intellectual property? What is it, and what's different about it?
Well, it's an amorphous set of rights to monopolies in relation to information. I don't think there's any coherent underlying principle, because I don't believe that it's actually fundamentally justified. But if it were, the principle would be something like people who create some useful information have some right to coercively prevent others from using that information without their permission, to give people an economic incentive to create that information.
Got it. So why do you think it's different than other property? Because if you are the generator of the new information, let's call it, anything new that is created is inherent, even if it's a combination or recombination of elements that already exist, which frankly I would argue is that's pretty much all creativity is.
Yes, quite.
It's simultaneously nothing is created, I don't think tabula rasa, but at the same time that doesn't diminish the novelty and originality when you
indeed.
When you combine new elements that nobody else ever did and that had never been before. That is creativity. But I guess my point is, so that's the process. And so it is new. You made it. You or a group of people made it. Yeah. Then why do you see that is not different than, say, your house example?
Well, I mean, I didn't make my house; I bought it, right? So that's not the same thing.
Well, that's just the
thing that has been made.
That's just a sequential matter, right?
Yes. You worked
to earn the money that effectively built it, right? Yeah. When you own it.
I mean, the difference is the thing that has been made, in the case of information, can be used without limits by an unlimited number of people without interfering with anyone else's ability to use it. Whereas my house and any physical property can't be, and that's the fundamental distinction. And so the justification for true property is regularizing the fact that there's a conflict in who can use the physical resource at the same time. It says limiting resource. That is the fundamental underlying concept of true property, limited resource. Infinitely duplicable information is not a limited resource fundamentally. It can be artificially limited, but the fact the limit is artificial by so-called IP law itself tells us that the justification is not the same as it is for true property.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I guess that depends, or it hinges on one accepting your view that property rights even is primarily or exclusively about control of finite resources. I need to think about that one a little bit.
It's not just my view. Again, that's Professor Harris's view as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, this line of this view, because it's certainly not I don't think it's necessarily the dominant one, because I don't know that the scarcity or non-scarcity of a piece of property necessarily dictates whether one should have rights to it or not. I guess if I'm thinking
whether one should have any rights, it's whether one should have ownership rights. Right, so the property rights are not any kind of right. There's a fundamental distinction between owning and owing. So not all rights are property rights. You can have contractual rights that are not property rights. You can have all kinds of rights that are not property rights. But property rights specifically are fundamentally based on ownership rights, which are an exclusive right to make use of a finite resource.
Well, yeah, and I guess in that line, because to me, property rights are, and this goes back to, frankly, the beginning of our conversation on natural rights. They're an extension of our necessity as human beings to take action to create the material goods and services that our life and survival depends upon. So, in a way, they are an extension
Yeah,
of your life. At least that's the chain of causality I draw, and then therefore the ethical principle that derives from it. Um, and then by that standard, anything you create kind of originally, that's just that's just a different kind of uh, thing that you own by right, I guess, by the mere fact of your creating it, right?
correct.
So I guess,
I mean,
you know,
but I mean, it's a different justification, right? Because it's perfectly possible in principle to have a society organized without any property rights. It just
yeah.
be very inefficient and very unpleasant to live in. So there's nothing fundamental about it. It's just that the property rights are justified because every given person is better off
Well,
if they're
because
in that position if they don't,
it encourages flourishing and and progress, human progress.
and enables people to have autonomy over their lives. Because if
Mhm.
you can't be satisfied from one minute to another that someone else isn't going to take your clothes away or sleep in your bed, then you can't really live a very meaningful life, or can't really control your own life, or plan anything, or do anything useful.
Well, and so then how do we solve the problem of encouraging creativity, the very acts that progress and prosperity and autonomy depend on? Because one
Right.
could argue, and many creators would, that it is that new thing, that new piece of information that they created, that's how they get the food and clothing that they need to
Yeah,
survive, right? So I guess that's the link back to the fundamental property.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
we come back then to how this links in with the conversation we were having before. So first of all, I quite agree. Creating things is very important, and it is important that people who create things have an incentive to do so. And indeed, it is theoretically possible that that could justify the system one has at present. I don't think it does, but that's separate from the question of whether it is in fact property. I think they're two quite separate questions.
Okay.
But actually, I think that the right answer to intellectual property, or what's now done as intellectual property, the right answer to incentivizing creators is not to give people a monopoly, which can be abused and concentrate power in very different ways to that which can be concentrated by the state, but
Okay.
concentrate in the hands of large corporations and people who have um, unreasonable levels of power and unsafe levels of power in that respect, and instead incentivized in precisely the same way as the welfare system would work under a dissipated model. So, in other words, the thing you'd be giving your money to under the system that would replace part of tax in a dissipated system is not just welfare, but also creativity. So people would be able to fund not just relief of poverty, but creation of artistic works. People would be able to fund research of all kinds. So you put research under the banner of what people would pay out of their welfare allowance for, or non-governmental allowance. And that would be precisely the same way as welfare is funded. You have the same level of dissipation. And so this isn't just about, as I think some more traditional left-wing thinkers might think, taking power away from one and giving it to another. It isn't about transfer of power from the state to private companies. It's about universal dissipation of concentrated power. And if one is truly classically liberal, right, one would be equally interested in concentrations of power that are not directly in the hands of the state, that are in the hands of private corporations. And the answer is not, as many people, I think, on the old-fashioned left may think, to take power away from one to give to the other. That doesn't solve the problem. That actually makes it worse. You don't solve the problem of one lot of people having too much power by giving even more power to someone else. You solve it by dissipating power.
Yeah.
So it's dissipation versus concentration is the fundamental answer.
Got it. And that's the link, I guess, back to even the topic of welfare, is that this is
Precisely.
another form of concentrated power.
Yes.
Although I guess I would quibble a little bit, because I think there is a fundamental distinction between what we might call political or coercive power versus economic power. To me, the former is it's all rooted in force. That's the fundamental
Yes.
power that's exercised. I do this or else I will take this from you. Whereas economic power to me is the power to create. And that's a fundamentally different kind of power, both in nature and in kind and even in degree, I would argue. So I'm not sure I'm not sure the concentration question is the fundamental variable of importance to evaluate in that
Yes.
domain.
I mean, I would agree that there is a fundamental important distinction between coercive and non-coercive power. I would tend to describe non-coercive power as power to persuade rather than power to create, because creation isn't
Yes.
really a power in that sense. But the important thing is, so far as so-called intellectual property is concerned, it is in fact coercive. People are in fact coerced from doing things that amount in current jurisdictions to a violation of intellectual
Well,
property.
right.
People are coerced from creating things of their own volition that are the same as something someone else has created, or partly the same as something someone else has created. And
Yeah.
so it is precisely the concentration of coercive power. And what's more, if you end up with private corporations with a lot of concentrated coercive power, they will tend to cooperate with the other people with a lot of concentrated coercive power, the state, to abuse their power.
Well, right. I was going to say, so I think where it gets gray or where it becomes coercive type of power is, like you said, I guess, because it's the state granting you this monopoly, right? That's where I see. Yeah. That's very interesting. It's funny. So where I first heard this argument against IP, at least blanket IP rights, was actually Matt Ridley. I'm sure you've, I don't know if you've read any of his.
I can't place the name, but yes.
Oh, he's a British scholar and intellectual writer. He writes on a lot of contemporary topics, economic and politics related, and he kind of a futurist, pro progress one. He had a book called How Innovation Works, which was really like chasing the history of human innovation and trying to induce and deduce, I guess, kind of some general principles. And that was where I think it came out in like 2020, 21. Great book. But he had a whole section devoted to intellectual property and actually why he thought it could often be a hindrance to progress and innovation because of
it delayed the Industrial Revolution by decades, the patents on steam engines.
Yeah. So you think that this same solution, similar to the welfare case, of people being compelled to fund creative and artistic works, but still have the choice, you think that's sufficient enough to solve the creative incentive problem? Or do you think there's still some gaps that need filling some other way if you don't have IP right protections?
I think the problem is that the solution is worse than the problem as it currently stands. So the level of coercion, in particular in modern times when information is more important, that can be exercised, significantly exceeds the benefit of that coercion. And I think there's no properly controlled evidence that a lot of the creativity that people claim is only there because of that monopoly power would in fact not be there but for that monopoly power.
You're saying maybe
before copyright existed, people still wrote plays and music, right? It still was a thing. Before copyright existed, people still wrote plays and music. Copyright did not exist in Shakespeare's time, but Shakespeare still wrote plays.
Yeah. Well, so you're saying correlation doesn't equal causality, essentially.
Well, there isn't even a correlation to look at because one doesn't even have an opposite case. So,
well, no, I mean, some people have made the case that the explosion of innovation in the last 200 to 300 years did correlate with the protection of property rights, including IP rights.
Yes.
Certainly in the Western.
They're lumping property and so-called IP together, which of course is fundamentally invalid, even if you think that IP is justified.
Well, right. You made that. I'm just making the case of like the status quo position, right? And I mean, again, I guess this gets back to the debate we just had, right? Of whether intellectual property should be properly classified under the same category as property rights. But insofar as they are, by most human societies, especially modern ones, that package, there's no doubt that those countries that don't have that package have not had as much progress and innovation as those that do, right? So I think that's at least the correlation that people look to and point to and say
that might be because of the existence of intellectual property rights, stopping them from actually being able to innovate based on other people's inventions, right? They may be prohibited from doing the things.
Well, and that was one of my final questions, was just what do you even if you could give some even concrete illustrations of where you think IP becomes a problem. The welfare one was easy. We started it off even by giving some examples of how that was a problem. But how do you see it as as the negative consequences of it, the
Well,
current
I mean,
status quo.
one good example is what's called colloquially big tech. So in other words, people starting an online service, acquiring a monopoly over it by starting by making it very attractive to users, and then deliberately being increasingly hostile to users, increasingly malicious to those users, deliberately making the service worse, and then stopping any kind of competition by using intellectual property rights. Right? So that's people with concentrated coercive power deliberately harming people. Look at examples such as Facebook and YouTube and places like that. They do cause quite serious problems in that regard, and they have an excessive and unsafe level of power for that reason. And the solution to that is if one of the things that one person could do, either spend money on or spend their time on, as the case may be, to the value of the money in question, was instead of paying that proportion in terms of tax, was creating open source software or openly available services. And it must be open source with very strictly protected licenses, incidentally, to stop people from, well, unless you abolish IP entirely, of course, the better way of doing it.
Right.
But contributing to open source software, even if you don't abolish IP fully, you would very significantly undermine the coercive monopoly of a lot of the large technological companies.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess the libertarian or kind of laissez-faire argument that accepts still the IP regime would argue that those people still have a choice fundamentally to choose alternatives in the market context, and so it's not really a monopoly that these firms have, because they can be competed against still, even if they have a disproportionate share of that market. So I think that when we use the term harm, it's of a different kind and degree perhaps than when the state is wielding coercive power.
One of the real problems is that there isn't, again, there is state coercive power involved, in that people, because of intellectual property rights, are not able to connect their networks to someone else's networks, not able to reproduce things.
So it's a government enforced restriction.
It's a government enforced monopoly.
I see. Yeah. Interesting. Wow. You made even some totally new points that Matt Ridley didn't, and others like him. And it's interesting. I mean, this may just be a case of coincidence, correlation, not causality, but that I wonder, that these both kind of emanate from British sources. I wonder if there's something in even the English experience, recent or historical, that makes that, I don't even know, is the IP regime less strong in England than the US? Because the US is quite powerful.
No, I don't think it's any less strong. I don't think there's any. I think it's probably just a coincidence. Okay. I don't think there's anything particular.
I rarely hear Americans making that argument, but maybe I'm just not in the conversation.
I suspect it may be a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
there was a time when there was more resistance to so-called intellectual property in the States than there was in the UK and Western Europe, because, as is the case perhaps with places like China now, the consequence would be that they'd be less able to use things that were invented elsewhere, and they wouldn't get more of a benefit from it. So I don't think that is the historical position. And in fact, I think in some respects the intellectual property law in the US is more lenient than in the UK. I think certainly fair use rights are more extensive over there, for example. So I don't think there's anything general about that. I think that's probably just a coincidence.
Well, and there's another concrete example right there of some of the problems, right? At least certainly if you're thinking about human welfare more broadly and progress, it definitely retards the advance of this information and product development globally.
There's a really critical connection between the welfare and the IP in terms of adverse incentives, which is this. In a system in which politicians get votes for spending other people's money, there is a strong incentive to seize as much money as possible without being seen to increase tax rates. And one way of doing that is by creating artificial monopolies. Because if you create a monopoly, right, if you use your coercive force to create a monopoly, you can increase the amount of profits that a business makes. Right? So it charges its customers more, or charges them things when something would otherwise be free, rent seeking, which is always abusive and actually unhelpful and damaging to net welfare. And you can then tax those extra profits. You're getting more tax because the business is making more profit. So the less competition there is in the market, the more tax revenue you can make, because the businesses are making more profit than they should be making because of your coercion to increase the tax, yours and the government's, but you're not seen to increase the tax rate. So in a system in which the state people get elected by spending other people's money, there is this perverse incentive, which there's overwhelming evidence that is used whenever the state can get away with it, of creating monopolies and harming consumer interests, doing that deliberately to conceal and deceive people about how the state actually makes the money that it's spending. So the two are intricately connected.
I like that. QED, as some would say, right?
Right.
In Latin. And thank you. You kind of brought it all full circle. So, if there's any kind of key takeaways, it would be, kind of the least coercive means that generates the best outcome, and diffusing the power to the most number of deciders. Those are kind of, I think, the two governing principles to take away from.
And also, don't conflate the problem with the solution. Right? It's perfectly possible to have a different solution for a particular problem, such as welfare or creator incentives. One by denying the appropriateness of the current solution, one is not denying there's a real problem that needs to be solved. And we looked at this in the problem hijacking video that we have in our channel. We have a look at our videos on our YouTube channel, the Liberal Concepts Explainer series. It's really important to distinguish between saying I disagree with the solution on the one hand, on the other hand saying I don't think there's a problem. You can perfectly well say I agree there's this problem needs to be solved, but I think your way of solving it makes it worse and this is an alternative.
Well, I agree with you, and I'm glad that you invoked at the outset of the conversation the kind of false alternative fallacy that's embedded in that, because I think that's often the case where particularly defenders of the status quo generally, but the kind of more coercive government status quo structure, the best way they tend to defend it is by setting up that false alternative that if not government, then there's no other alternative that's going to solve this problem. And for people who accept there is a problem, it does leave them without great options, right? So
precisely.
That's why it's a fallacy, I guess. So that's another plug for the Liberal Concepts Glossary and Explainer, which you are the primary author of. So, and they're great. If you haven't, anybody out there listening, haven't checked that out on ILV's website, you definitely need to, because it helps you make sense of a lot of these concepts that we're invoking here today, and to just make sense of these issues in day-to-day life as well.
Yes, and if you give people the tools to understand their oppression, they can much more easily communicate that and resist it.
Well said. Any final thoughts or things you want to add, or because otherwise I think we covered the ground we wanted to on today's discussion.
Yes. I think I'd perhaps conclude with a metaphor in this sense. I think in many ways coercive power is like fire, right? It's something that is in some ways very necessary to human flourishing, but can also be very dangerous. And perhaps one day in time we'll find a replacement for it where we don't need it at all, but we haven't reached that stage yet.
Well said. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time at the next Dissidents. Thanks, James.
Have a lovely afternoon. Cheerio.
Great conversation. Cheers, you too.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.